Michael is there you go. Got it. Yeah, so I'm Michael L, director here at Improving Delivery Services. And yeah, today I'm going to share my screen. Sorry about that. I thought I was already sharing. Host has disabled screen. Who's the host for this? This is the host.
Well, I was. You guys are managed. It actually reads.
Who are you logged in as?
Where are you?
There's a Calgary Agile host up top.
No, it should be Michael L. We have too many. Can you guys make Michael L the co-host, please?
Too many of us.
You are now the co-host.
I think.
Just
yeah.
popped up from the
And
top.
now the co-host. Sweet. Okay, we get a little interception here just for a second. Okay. So this. Okay, here we are. So, okay, now we're up and running. It's all good. So today we're going to talk about GitHub Copilot. You know, it is kind of a beginner one. So if you've used it, you know, there might be some things you learn, but if not, hopefully you come away and you kind of have a better understanding of what Copilot is and what it can offer. Okay, and then it's like tab your way to success with a question mark, because maybe you can, maybe you can't. And so, yeah, well, we'll kind of see where this goes. But yeah, so we're going to say, you know, here's some of the things we're going to talk about today. So GitHub Copilot, what is it? Get a basic understanding of this. We're going to talk about context and prompts. So, you know, how many people are using ChatGPT right now? Just about everybody in the room, but sure online, everyone is too. But you'll know that the way you ask, you know, ChatGPT a question significantly influences the answers you get back. And so for us to kind of utilize Copilot, that kind of context or prompting is actually a little beneficial as well, to kind of understand how this thing works. So it's almost the same for us. Then I'm going to kind of get into, I'm going to share my experiences with this. And anyone else who's kind of played with it, feel free to jump in. I'll give you a demo. This is always a fun part. This is probably where we'll spend most of our time. And it's a live demo. So we're dealing with like a bit of a sentient being in the cloud. So we'll see what kind of answers it gives us. It can be interesting. And if we have time, you know, we'll kind of walk through a couple challenges. We'll have some key takeaways. Okay. And feel free to interrupt me anytime to ask questions. Right? Okay. The first thing, what is it? So, you know, GitHub Copilot first is actually a paid service. And what it is it actually lives inside of your IDE, and it's called, you know, it's coined a generative AI coding tool. So it's going to help developers write code at the very basics, right? And when I say IDEs, and I think everyone here pretty much has a technical background. So if I say something, by all means, just that's kind of out there, put up your hand and, you know, just say, hey, what's that? Right? But development environment, right? So currently it's supported by, you know, Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio with the JetBrains suite of products. I think NeoVim, and, you know, I started to use it in Azure Data Studio as well to write some kick-ass queries. But yeah, It's pretty cool. And at a super high level, what it's going to do is it's going to somehow take some of your code, ship it off to that large language model up there. This is kind of how I envision this thing in the cloud, right? It's a giant computerized brain. And this is the thing that's going to give us our answers back, right? So somehow some code is going to go out and we're going to it's going to try to figure out what we're going to do next. And it's going to give us a suggestion back inside of our IDE. Okay. And that project code that it's sending out there, if you guys remember, I referred to that as like that context or prompts. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Now, the kind of important part to recognize here is that your code is actually leaving, let's say, your machine and going somewhere else, right? So privacy is a concern, and you want to make sure everyone's on board when you're using these kinds of tools, right? And with GitHub Copilot, there's kind of two licenses that hang around, right? There's a personal license and a business or an enterprise license. If you use a personal license, unless things have changed, any of that code that you send out to the giant brain in the cloud, they're actually going to use that to help train the model. So you want to be really careful about that, right? Because you don't want to have this thing, all of a sudden regurgitate your code to someone else later on down the road. Right? Whereas a business or enterprise license, it's supposed to be transient in nature, meaning that code or that context is going to get shipped up. Just all it's going to be used for is to give you some suggestions back, and then it's gone. Okay, so that's a big one. Make sure we're all on board. If you're going to try to introduce this, you're going to use this at clients. Okay, let's get into some context of prompts. And like I said, this is very similar to ChatGPT. Depending on how you ask the question, you get some different answers back. If you're pretty vague, right, you'll get probably not the answer you're looking for, right? And then you'll kind of whittle down and you have these conversations. So let's just kind of look at a simple C#, class here, and it's just a playlist, right? So think of Spotify or your whatever streaming music you're using, where you kind of have this playlist with a name, and within that name you can have some songs, and you can add and remove some songs, right? So we're kind of going to use this little code sample just to give you some introduction into how Copilot works and the things that we can do to help it along the way. Because we kind of want to know a little bit about how Copilot's working to help improve our suggestions. Okay, how does it get context? So the first thing is the current file you're working at. So I'm in my IDE, I'm kind of hanging away on code. It's gonna cruise through. It can't send up your entire project up into the cloud. It has a limit. So, but it is going to look at the current file, which kind of makes sense. The next one is comments, and this may not be that intuitive, but if you start adding comments into your code, you got to remember it's going up, and that big brain in the cloud is going to interpret and read those comments. So you can actually add some comments in here to help it give you better answers, right? So you see, I've kind of added a little bit of a comment up here that, hey, this is a playlist domain object with read-only properties of ID, name, and songs. And then as I start typing, Copilot is going to start chugging away, and it's actually going to read that comment and try to help me with code, right? So while this isn't a live demo, essentially what happens is it's going to give me like this, public ID with a get, and it's read-only, there's no setters, but it actually reads those comments and echoes back, tries to give you the code that you're looking for. The other thing you'll see down here on like line 23, I have a method called add song, right? We want to add songs to our playlist. We really like them. What we're going to do is if it didn't already do this, I added a comment in here for check for duplicates. And then Copilot's actually going to understands the language that I'm in. And it's actually going to provide a suggestion that's going to check for duplicate. So I'm kind of talking to it in English to help me code. Okay. Fill in the middle, kind of this is more of a history lesson, kind of intuitive too. When Copilot first came out, and the team is trying to optimize it and everything. The first kick at it, what they did is they said, wherever your cursor is, I'm just going to try to look at the code that's ahead of it as context or before it, right? And any of us that are like, that are slinging on some code around, it doesn't usually work that way. It's not necessarily sequential, right? So now, they've kind of tweaked it so that they're sitting there, okay, wherever that cursor is, I'm going to look at the stuff before, the stuff after, and I'm going to try to fill in the middle and guess what you're trying to do. Neighboring tabs is kind of interesting. So like I said, remember, as you're kind of coding away, just like in ChatGPT, you got a text and a prompt, you're trying to give it information, right? So sometimes if you're working away with this, you'll see most IDEs, they allow for multiple tabs, right? You're working with things, multiple files at the same time. So to kind of nudge it in a certain direction to help it as well, it'll actually look at neighboring tabs. So things around the current file that you're working on. So for example, if I had this method add song, you'll see it's taking in a song, right? And I've opened up the song actual class next to it so that as it starts picking things up, it can peek into that file and see the structure of it. Okay, so when I said check for duplicates, somehow it magically knew that this thing had an ID on it. And usually that's because, well, I've kind of helped it, right? So while these tools are awesome, you do want to have an understanding of how they're working a little bit in the background to help improve the results. Other things are function names, right? Because fundamentally, these large language models, like they're natural language processing, right? So just as we speak, it just kind of understands it and interprets it. So, and this is just a good programming practice, we want to have meaningful function names, right? So if I say add song, like it's pretty intuitive, right? It's actually going to understand the language again, and it's going to know what to do. And try to be consistent. Most developers in general, they're consistent. They kind of have an understanding of when they write things, they're kind of predictable, right? But that also helps Copilot try to figure out what you're doing next. And I guess the example down here is I have a method called remove song. And this is the first little hint of Copilot that I'm going to show you, where I started to type in remove capital S, right? Consistent naming and, a good function name. And you'll see this little gray text. This here is, the ghost writing, right? This is Copilot saying, hey, I think this is what you want to do. And if this is it, hit tab and you'll take that code right into your development environment, right? This is the way you can tab your way to success, hopefully. And we'll see a little bit of this as we go, right? But that little bit of information there that it's kind of spitting out, like it's actually not committed yet. And I can hit escape and that will say, nope, that's not the stuff I want. But if it's good, I'll hit tab. And basically that code is actually pretty good. I would accept that. Right? So as you're typing away, this thing's like trying to figure things out, which is pretty darn cool. And there's probably a slew of others. I don't know, like I said, if anyone has any other little hints, if they've used it, by all means, feel free to speak up. I've heard all kinds of things, like sometimes if you paste things into memory, it helps. I don't know if that's true, but. Any questions so far? Oh, good. Okay, I'll give you my experience. So way back when, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, way back when, I kind of Copilot, like I saw this, I signed up. It was like a preview thing, right? Signed up on the waiting list and I got accepted. I was so excited. Put it all in there, kind of did it. Maybe it was even more than 2 years ago. I can't even remember. It's all been such a blur. It was pre-COVID. It's pre-COVID. And unfortunately, the result was, this thing, I don't get it, right? Maybe it's not that cool. It seems to be getting in the way of my flow, kind of frustrating me. I didn't really like it. Like, honestly. So yeah, turned it off, uninstalled it, got rid of it. And then, of course, last November, beginning of this year, January, Chat GPT comes out, and then you're just like, holy crap. Start playing around with that thing, and like the amount of code that thing can barf out, you're just like, wow, this thing's pretty good. I think this is going to change how we do some stuff. I better take a serious look at this again and kind of force myself into this and give it a good evaluation. Okay. So got an enterprise license, privacy reasons, right? Went in there, got it, using it. And the first thing I kind of said when I said, hey, it got in the way. You got to remember these IDEs that we have these days, they are good, right? They already offer you a bunch of suggestions and things pop up, and they're really good and they're intuitive. And I saw there's this big battle between Copilot and my IDE popping up, this conflict. And I really wanted to give Copilot a go. So it actually took me a bit. I'm a JetBrains guy, so I like that suite of tools. So I had to turn some things off in order to kind of find maybe a sweet spot where Copilot is taking more precedence rather than my development environment. But, I don't think I've actually got the perfect setup yet, but still working on it. But this can be very annoying at first. Very annoying. You got conflicting tools trying to give you suggestions. Now, I'd say right now, that's me in the middle. Confused as usual, trying to figure stuff out. Got a cool haircut. But in the past, right? Chrome Stack Overflow. It's like, I don't know how to do stuff. Man, I'm going that route. That's it, right? So go to Stack Overflow essentially. But now that I've kind of forced myself into this, and I guess it's been, I don't know, 6 months now. I've been using this pretty heavy. These icons, which are actually probably even smaller, kind of dictate this, how much I use things. So you see Copilot icons a little bigger, Chrome Stack Overflow a little smaller. I'd say now it's even smaller. And this chat, usually my flow was, I try to stay inside the IDE, but I would still have Chat GPT open on the side that I can do a little rubber ducky bouncing some ideas off it, right? Just kind of kicking some thoughts back and forth. But Copilot just introduced Copilot Chat, which is in preview, and we're going to see it today. And essentially, it's kind of like having Chat GPT inside my development environment. So now I'm going out less and less to even Chat GPT. I'm staying inside of my IDE, which is great because I know our minds tend to wander, right? We go out on the web, figure out our next holidays, figure out how to fix my slice, all that kind of fun stuff, right? But yeah, you're in your IDE now, and yeah, you can get in the zone. So I really see a shift here now that I've kind of forced myself to use it. Any questions on that? Oh, and if someone can let me know about anything happening online, that would be great.
I think it's just a comment, but I think there are some in the chat.
Yeah, if we have a moderator, that would be awesome.
There's someone checking them out.
Facilitate. Okay. All right, demo time. Let's see what we got in store. Now, there's a number of demos we can do. I'm choosing two, and I'm going to try to cruise through one pretty quick because I made a special demo for this group, being agile. Okay. Special just for you. But the first one we're going to do is we're going to do a simple visual layout. Okay, so it's a little web project. It's going to be React, something called styled components. But the idea is that we're going to want to create a simple layout with navigation on the left, content on the right, footer all the way across the bottom. Okay. And as we go through this, don't worry too much about syntax if you're not a developer. Focus more on what Copilot's doing and how I interact with it. And I'm going to try to remember. Some people haven't seen this before, so hopefully I'll explain it as we go. Okay. But just a little bit of a hint. We're going to use something called CSS grid layout, which, like I jump around on a lot of technologies and I can't keep all this stuff in my head. Plus I'm getting old. So it's like, just to remember all this syntax, challenging, right? And CSS grid, CSS itself is like a magical, mystical beast, let alone this grid layout. But the idea about this is essentially it's a grid. So it deals with columns and rows. So you see, we got 2 columns and 2 rows here, essentially. Okay. And there's a name here. And the way CSS grid works is you can name certain areas of your page that you want to put components into, right? The little Lego blocks. Good, Gary? All right. Okay. So just a little background there on CSS grid, because it'll be interesting if Copilot cooperates. You'll see it kind of pick some things up, and this naming of areas is kind of important. Okay. Style components, I don't want to push through this too much, but it's a little weird syntax. It's just one of these, CSS and JavaScript, and so I just on page and I can just write some stuff. But in the end, this thing's gonna barf out, right? Some classic styles, laws of the browser, and gives us a hot pink background because who doesn't want a hot pink background? But generally speaking, the only reason I'm talking about this is just to kind of give you just a little sample of the knowledge that this thing has, right? That it can do, and this is just one little snippet. So we're gonna have React, we're gonna have some CSS, we're gonna have some styled components kicking in. Just one tiny little step. Any questions on that before I dive into the code?
Michael, we do have a question in the chat from Roman, and he asks, can I use Copilot to develop applications for my job? And how about licenses?
Yeah, okay, and Roman, you sure can. It's a paid service, and before you consider it for your job, I would highly recommend you get an enterprise license. We kind of talked about this a little earlier. There is some privacy concerns if you just go with a personal license, because it can be used, your code can actually go up to help train the model.
So go ahead, Roman, if you want to jump in here and clarify your question. It says, FOSS, FOSS only?
I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah. Okay, that's okay. We can come back to it at the end. Go ahead.
Okay. Free and open source.
Free and open source.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, if you're okay with, you don't have any, you'd still have to pay for the service using a personal license. It's okay if you're banging out some kick butt intellectual property, if you're okay if it's going to be regurgitated maybe at some point down the road. Yeah, by all means. But okay. So let's get into the demo. What I've got here is I've scaffolded up a simple kind of React app, like I said, with all that kind of plumbing bits, style components, things like that. I don't know, can everybody see that? That's pretty good. It's pretty small, but given what we've learned so far, right? And given what our objective is, you'll see how I added some comments up here, and I'm not going to type this out just because I'm a horrible typer. It's very embarrassing. But you'll see, so what we're going to say is kind of what we were describing, right? And remember what was said about context? It reads comments, right? So I'm going to try to guide this thing in a certain direction. So I'm going to say, hey, this is the shell or the layout of the application. It'll show navigation on the left, content on the right, and the footer on the bottom across both navigation and content. We use CSS grid and names template areas, the 2 rows and 2 columns for the layout, style components for CSS styles. So I'm trying to guide this thing along. So hopefully it can help me produce this code a little bit better or quicker. Okay, so, oh, and I always forget. So this guy here, this is our little Copilot hanging out with us. This is installed here. And when I start typing, you'll see this thing spin, and that's it thinking. Okay. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. But so first thing I'm going to do, so I hit enter, and you see immediately it goes, wow, I want to import React from React. And I'm like, wow, I'm a little dangerous. I know I don't need that one. So I'm going to escape out of this. That was a bad suggestion. So I'm just going to start typing just to see what it's going to do. So, okay, right here, it's going, okay, I think you're creating a React component. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? This is a pretty good start. I'm going to go with this. I'm going to tab my way to success. And then it understands React. So here it's created a component and says, hey, I need to export this thing. Once again, don't worry about the syntax too much. Focus on kind of that little ghost writing that's popping up all over the place. That's the giant brain in the cloud doing its thing. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good start. Still wants to import React really bad. Now I'm going to get into a bit of a pattern here. Okay, so typically, like if I was to write CSS, I may have this thing called a container, right? A container is like a div with a bunch of little styles around it. But in this page, I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to say shell container, and immediately it's going, oh, I think you want to do style components. Pretty cool. I like where it's going. I'm getting an error here, so this is, I'm going to leverage my IDE to import this. But let's see what it comes up with next. Okay, this syntax here, this is saying, hey, you mentioned you wanted to do CSS grid. So I am going to help you. And that is the syntax that I'm looking for. CSS grid. And it says, how many columns essentially do you want? It's helping me. And this is like all this weird syntax, right? Unless you know this stuff inside and out, this is kind of foreign. So 2 columns, 2 rows. I'll change the fractions because they're wrong. They're completely wrong. But it doesn't quite know. It's not reading a visual. So I'll give it. Grid template areas. Let's see if it gets this. Okay, navigation content. Butterfoot nailed it. Okay, we'll walk through this. Okay, so here I am, tabbing my way to success with, didn't quite figure that out. Now this is some crazy syntax, right? So I said, I want 2 rows, 2 columns. And I remember I said with CSS grid, you have these named areas. And essentially with the grid template area, this represents the layout of your page where you're going to have an area called navigation, an area called content. So this is 1 row. This is another row, right? And this is 1 column and another column. So it picked this up out of my comments, right? To help me code. So I'm like, ah, you know what? I'm pretty happy with this. So I'm going to replace this with shell container. And fundamentally, it's created the layout for me based off of context and me kind of understanding a little bit how it works and guiding it. Okay, so we're just going to do a little bit more. So right there, it's going, okay, remember it's trying to fill in the middle. It's looking at the code above, code after, and it goes, wow, you just did a style div. I think you want that again, but that's kind of not what I want to do. I actually want to create another component. So I'm going to escape this, but I will go navigation and still wants to do it. So I got to help it a little bit more. See what it comes up with. Returns div h1 navigation. Well, you know what? That was okay. I'm going to tab it, and I'm just going to get rid of this header. Kind of clean that up a little bit. All we want to say is, hey, this is our navigation. So we're just going to create a component here. And in similar fashion, we'll see how It does want to create a footer, but I want to get it to, yeah, okay. Here we go. So it recognizes it's starting to recognize a pattern in my coding, right? And it's going, hey, what you did before is you created a container, right? The style, the lipstick. I think you want to do that again. And I'm going to use your same naming conventions to help you along. I like where that's going. Okay, this is kind of cool. Remember I said about CSS grid? Is you have named areas for this thing to put this component in. And that area's name is actually called navigation. So given all the context that it has, it's going, hey, this thing that you're going to use is actually going to go live in the navigation area. Just based off of the name. That's pretty wild stuff. Right? And yeah, we'll do that. We'll give it some background color, except we'll make it container. Okay. Now remember, we want footer and we want content and footer here. So I'm just gonna keep on typing and hopefully it starts picking some stuff up. Content container? Yeah, sure, we'll go with that. Grid area content, it recognizes, hey, this thing wants to go into where the content should be. And probably it's guessing, it's going, okay, well, you went red. I don't know, maybe you want blue. Why not? Which is pretty good. Now it's going, oh, by the way, now you're into a component. You want a component again. And it remembers what I did before to start my layout. That's pretty cool. Footer, all good. And I'm just going to keep on tabbing my way because I'm liking what's going on. Decides to go green. And then back. So this is that. Remember I said about being consistent and its naming? Well, you see what it's doing there is it's actually picking up my patterns and my naming conventions as I go along. That is pretty darn wicked. And it understands CSS grids, where things should go based off of names, which is pretty awesome. And now I just deleted that. So it goes, oh, I'm guessing you're going to want navigation in here with content and a footer. Okay. Let's see if this thing even works. There it is. Oh, it's beautiful, right? The layouts. Remember I said the sizing's kind of all wrong. I want that at 1, 7, 8. See, again, I'm dangerous enough to know my way around this, but there you go. So that is pretty impressive, as ugly as that is. The amount of things that we just hammered out there, and the amount of little bit of information that we scattered in there, React, style components, CSS, grid layouts, like that thing just basically picked all this up on its own. I think it's pretty impressive. Any questions?
So for someone who knows absolutely nothing, how useful is tab complete always constantly? Like if you started from scratch and just hit tab complete like 50 times, what would you get and would it be useful?
Eventually you'll be in trouble. So
you have to know something.
So you totally have to know, and that's why it's called Copilot, not autopilot, right? And in a perfect world, and we'll get into this hopefully a little bit, the way I would love to see all this kind of going is I focus less on syntax and more on properly designing software to patterns and principles, right? And, I become like, I don't know, a code orchestrator of sorts or a conductor, right? Where I know enough that I have to review its code, but I'm going to be saying, hey, do this for me, and I'll guide you along the way. So yeah, it's Copilot, not autopilot. If you still have to know what you're doing, and it is a productivity tool.
So in your experience, how efficient is that in basically well-established big projects? Like it's greenfielding, obviously, like a thing, but like when you work with like files with thousands of dependencies and you want to just change some logic or find some bug, like real life scenarios, right? From your experience, how efficient something like that would be, assuming that developers who are working really in these big projects usually have less worry about syntax, they know it inside out, and more worry about, as you said, the logic and the concept, right?
It's a good question. And I gotta say, like, I'm in a couple of those projects right now where, and I don't know the language at all. Right? And I can't show everything that Copilot can do, but one of the things you can do is you can actually highlight some code and you can say, well, explain this to me, right? And it'll actually hammer out an explanation of what that code is doing. So it is, I find it extremely helpful. Or you can highlight some code and you can say, I don't know the syntax. Can you inject something in here? And maybe we'll get to an example of that, but it will actually bring up a diff window saying, okay, this is the old code based off of what you asked. Here's the new code. Do you want to accept or reject this? So I find it in large projects, like I'm in one right now. I don't know the project at all. I'm finding it very useful. But, yeah. And it depends on your language too, right? Like a lot. This is the one thing about GitHub Copilot is it does understand a lot of languages. Some of these other guys that are coming out, you know, they might understand just a couple. Copilot knows a lot of flavors of languages.
Michael, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. One is from Emrinder. How does it help when we are working on legacy code base?
And you know what? I hope that last kind of question helped where if you don't quite understand the syntax or something that's happening or some convoluted code, like I said, you can ask it to explain it, or you can highlight some code and say, hey, is there any way we can improve this? Right? And it'll actually rewrite your code for you, give you a suggestion.
Then that ChatGPT as well.
Yeah. Or do you see any sort of issues with this?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think the question is how to understand the dependencies. Like all the examples that I've seen is just like a single file or two files, as you said, like this stat feature. But like usually with huge legacy code base, it's like, again, hundreds and thousands sometimes of files that with dependencies. So how to consume that in order to give you like
yeah, once again, you have to understand how it works. So depending on the language and the current file and maybe some neighboring tabs, you might have to nudge it along the way, right? And it does understand, you know, usually dependencies are brought in up top in files, like, oh, I'm using this library or I'm importing this library. Yeah, it'll read that and it'll understand it. I'm not saying it's going to be 100%, but yeah, it'll try its best for sure.
Thanks, Michael. Another question. This is from Alan, is there anything to prevent subtle malware from making its way into training and thereby propagating?
Well, you know what? That's a good question because it is trained on open source and it's a very common, you know, yeah, there is a chance that you may get some naughty code in there, but they're doing more and more to kind of filter that stuff out. And yeah, so there's probably no guarantee, but this is kind of where you as the developer, the onus is on you to accept or reject something. I wouldn't just accept what it says, right? You have to understand what's happening there. And, you know, the other side to that is like, you know, and I think it was brought out here. Well, if I just kind of tab my way, what's going to happen, right? Probably not some good stuff. And it's not that different than if I was to go on Stack Overflow, like I said, and try to copy and paste some code up from there and slam it into my code base. You know, you still have the same problems where I'm trying to take something that someone else did and put it into my code.
A third question, if you'll indulge us. This is from Zed. For open source use, would there not be a concern in the code that is generated if it was based on and trained on code that is incompatible with OS licenses?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's not like it's not going to prevent things like that. Once again, you know, it's kind of your responsibility to accept things into your code base that it's suggesting. right? It's not a silver bullet, it's a productivity tool. Good questions.
Sorry, last question. Does it actually recognize the versions of like the language that you're using, like React 6 versus React 7? Like it has different syntax and stuff. Like how?
Usually pretty good, but it does touch on something that, you know, one of the challenges we'll kind of get into is that, you know, it is trained at a certain point in time, right? So, and it has to have a lot of data in order to understand what to do. So if you're working with the latest and greatest version, yeah, it's probably not going to be very helpful. It's probably going to want to fall back.
But in your comments, can you specify, like, let's say you're having like old version, can you say, okay, I'm working with React 2 and I want React 3, something like that?
Yeah, you betcha. It'll, because remember, and I would add some comments in there to help nudge it along the way to guide it's where it goes. I have a colleague that's working on a new project, and it's using Vue 3, and he's having some challenges in there because Vue 3 is relatively new, and the code base, you know, it seems to tend to want to fall back to the old Vue 2 way a lot. But give it some time and it'll train up and it'll be. But that is one of the challenges with this. Just like ChatGPT, right? It's a snapshot at a certain point in time. It's trained up to a certain.
Dates
Yeah.
that's cut off, but
Exactly. Exactly. Great questions. Okay. We got 15 minutes left. I want to make sure. Is that kind of what we're shooting for? 7:30-ish?
let's do it.
Okay. Okay. This is the sample that I kind of just did just for this group special. Okay. So. Okay, now that we kind of understand a little bit how this is going. Floating meeting controls. There we go. Okay. Given the context of what we know and how we can nudge it, you know, I said, hey, let's create a story for the Agile, right? The Agile group hammers out stories, writes stories, some schedules, things like that, all sorts of good stuff. So I said, okay, let's get a story out here and let's see if given this story, you know, and getting back to my kind of vision of, boy, I would sure like to be able to orchestrate some code and put in some practices. Can we actually get it to read this story and crank out some code for us? Okay. So I got this thing called translate orders. And, you know, I got to digress just for a second here. You know, I started thinking about these large, you know, OpenAI and, you know, Azure OpenAI, things like that, where I can deploy my own instance of this thing in the cloud and I can hammer at it. I started thinking about, well, how can I actually use this in today's, you know, as I'm building software and on it in, you know, client work, right? And as you start to think about that outside of just normal chat, you know, you're basically dealing with something that's going to give you inconsistent results, right? It's free form. It's just going to give you some text back, but it's like a giant super smart API in the cloud. Okay, so what I've done is I've actually created this API and GitHub Copilot helped me do this, but it's trying to take unstructured, you know, responses and return them back as structured responses. So in this example, but we're not going to deal with that. If anyone's interested in that, chat with me after. Fascinating experiment. So I'm going to say, as a fast food chain owner, trying to disrupt the industry, I'd like to be able to accept free-form order from a customer. The industry's kind of going down that way right now, right? Where you can pick, you can tap things and kind of get rid of the people taking your orders. But I like to take any sort of order, like natural language, display the order indicating quantity, size, and name of the items ordered, so that the customer can confirm and say, yeah, good to go. Got some acceptance criteria here. Given a free-form order indicating quantity, size, and name. In an example here, right? Like I'll have 2 cheeseburgers, medium chocolate milkshake, and three small French fries. When they're ordered, it should come out like this, right? And so I've given it some examples. So here's an interesting twist to writing stories in the new world, right? In addition, writing stories is always good to provide examples, but you're kind of making these things prompt friendly. You're starting to think about, hey, how can I help my team deliver software quicker by writing good stories if they're using these generative AI coding tools. Okay. So in the end, right? And so you'll see it interprets the two from a two, and it kind of should be parsing this thing out, essentially. Okay, so we're going to see if Copilot can actually interpret this story and do some stuff for us. Okay. Now, I said I was going to get into this Copilot chat. And this is like the Chat GPT for GitHub Copilot, where I sit inside here, but it's aware of my code. It's got that context. So for me, it's a better version of Chat GPT, right? Because that's how I want to use it. As I'm kind of working through this. So, and you'll see it's kind of got the same kind of concept. Like I can go bounce back and forth with this thing, which is pretty good. But going back to being a code orchestrator, conductor, like I said, I'm looking at this. Okay, I'm responsible for this. API already exists, already written it, but I have to have some way to consume it. So, you know, being in the industry a bit, I know separations of concerns is important, right? So I want something that consumes an API, and then I want stuff that draws to humans. Right? Good designs. So let's see what we can do here. Now I kind of cheated. I got some prompts here. Once again, just so to speed things up, given time. But given this story, and remember, I kind of understand how Copilot works, so I'm going to leave this tab open. Hopefully it'll use it for context. And then I can ask it, so I can enhance my prompt. So I'm going to say, write an API layer using Axios, which is a very, it's a specific library that helps us talk with APIs. That posts a value, that posts something, and I know the payload that it's expecting. And the endpoint is translate order, and the response is an array of order items. I'm kind of giving it a hint of the shape that it should expect and the shape that we should get back. But let's see if it can pick this out. Thinking away. It's giving me some good stuff. Okay, it hammered that out pretty darn quick. All right, well, let's see if we can tweak this a little bit. So I'm looking at this right now and I'm going, okay, it did Axios, it looks pretty good. Didn't quite pick up my orders, the items. So let's say, you don't have to spell either. You provide the properties. Well, that's a little disappointing. I thought, sorry, but I can only assist you with programming related questions. So that's one thing to note, is that this model just deals with code. It just trained on coding. So if I try to ask it the weather, it's going to go bad. Okay, let's say I prefer, if TypeScript, I prefer types over interfaces. I was kind of hoping that it would be able to pick up the order item. Let's see if we can nudge it. Ah, still can't do it. Okay.
Try order items one more.
You think so? Let's give it a go. That doesn't want to do it. Okay, but this looks okay, and I like the syntax that it's using. So, darn it. You know what? I was hoping it could pick up the types to say the name is going to be a string, the size is going to be a string, and the quantity is going to be a number. We'll have to fill that in ourselves. But anyway, so I got this code here, and I got some options. I can copy it, I can insert it wherever my cursor is, or I can create a new file, which is what we'll do. Okay, so file save as. Let's go into stories. Sounds good. Okay, so now my code is in here. Oh, it didn't actually export some things. I know I'm going to need to do that. And you can go back and forth with this thing too. Like if I'm kind of looking at this, I don't really want my consumer to know about this. So I'll change, we'll leave it at that for now, but I could get it to refactor this to say, just take in a string, right? I only want to expose a string to my consumers, but we won't go too far into that because you know we're going short on time. But essentially, we're going to want name as a string. What was the other one? Size, yeah. Size as a string. Going to be as a number. Okay. So that looks okay. I don't like that. I'm going to change this to translate order. Oh, and then so the thing about this endpoint though is I don't know where that endpoint is living. I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I have some settings. From settings, it's going to figure out where that is. Okay, and I'm going to show you kind of a, once again, this is Copilot as well. I can highlight some code and I can bring up, you know, kind of the suggestion. And I can say, maybe I don't remember the syntax for concatenating strings, whatever language it is. Okay, I'll spell it wrong. That's not my copy typing, that was on purpose.
Totally.
Okay, so do you see what it did here? Is it actually gives me a little bit of a diff. It says, here's the old code and here's the new code. Is this what you want, right? Me being the developer, I can accept or reject this. I'm going to accept this, which is all good.
Also, the base URL should be at the front, right?
Axios has all kinds of different flavors that you can do. I think this will work. But yeah, typically with Axios, you're right. You would set up a base URL that would be used for fundamentally. But we're just going to slam it in here for now. Okay, so I've created this API. Let's see if we can get a component. So the prompts. Let's add my prompts in here. So now remember my separation concerns. I got something that talks to my API. I got something now that's going to draw to some humans. So I'm going to say, hey, create some components needed to fulfill the translate order story. Use style components, center, everything in the middle. So I'm kind of describing to it how I'd like this thing to look. Okay. I got an input with a text box with multiple lines, a button that calls the translate order in the API. And then I want to, after I click that button, I would like to display kind of the parsed out order essentially. Okay. And it's in a list with no bullets, no bullet points. See what this thing comes up with. Okay, that's a lot of code that thing just cranked out. And you can almost see where this is going, right? Soon you'll probably be able to give it the actual image of the thing you want it to look like. It'll probably be able to generate code from this. So, okay, well, let's see what it's doing. So once again, I have to know what I'm doing. It's Copilot, not autopilot. And I'm going, okay, it imported a lot of stuff, which is cool. It imported translate orders, which is great. It did create an order item. So it created another one. We don't need that. So we'll fix that. And oh, looks okay actually. Got some typings. So I'm going to say move order item. Import from API. Okay, I don't know if anyone kind of understood what happened there. Is I'm going to rely on my typings in my API. So, and it decided to create a duplicate. And they said, oh, by the way, don't use that one, use this. use the one coming from the API. So it actually refactored my code, its code, and created a new one. So that's pretty good. It looks all typed up. Which one is anyways? I don't know. Let's see. Let's see what happens. Not. So got some angry red somewhere in here. Translated order. Didn't quite get this. Once again, you kind of have to know what's happening here. Is it more than, this is what I didn't want. Okay. Fundamentally, we'll change that. That's okay. So for the most part, I think it got a lot of stuff. I couldn't tell you if this is going to work or not, but let's give it a go. I think it is. It looks pretty close. So let's kind of change our app. Quickly look at some styles here. Kind of missed a couple things here. Let's see. Right. I don't know why it wants to go 320 pixels. Okay, let's see what. Okay, here's our page. So this is what it cranked out for us. Well, a little tweak here and a little tweak there, right? And let's take our acceptance criteria. I'll have 2 cheeseburgers, French fries. Okay, didn't quite work, but 2 times, I'm not sure why it added that, but actually it did a pretty good job. So, like I said, my back end kind of ran through, it translated, my free-form open text, called my API, took the results back and displayed them as a list, with no bullets beside it, showing quantity, size, and the item according to the story, right? So that's pretty impressive, I think, right? And it kind of shifts kind of how where you could see software development going, right? Is that we start to leverage these tools, start to define how we create stories, we become prompt friendly, right? Become prompt engineered stories to help our developers, right? And developers become little less on syntax, a little more on patterns and principles and design, because you can't do that yet. Didn't get the plural right though. It's too large cheeseburger. Shoddy API. Any questions on that? That's a lot of stuff we just covered, and that was a lot of code that thing cranked out. And it basically read our story, right? With a little helping of prompts, and it created this. Is there any? I see a question here. Or do we want to answer this after? Because I'm just about done. So do you want to leave some time for some Q&A?
Yeah, let's push through. And we've got 2 or 3 questions in the chat for you.
Okay. Let's go back to that's it for the demo. It actually cooperated pretty well. Where? Yeah. Okay. So we've done our demo and some of the challenges. It's going to give you incorrect code sometime. You really have to kind of see what it's doing. A lot of times, you know, it's gonna get it correct, but oh yeah, it'll hammer out just something that's completely wrong. It'll totally do it. Just like ChatGPT, it can become delusional, right? With that little chat window on the side, I've kind of had to like try to reset it. It can get hard, right? Because it's got some weird context in its head. But same thing as ChatGPT, it can go off the rails. Probably because I asked it some weird stuff, right? Didn't quite guide it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Takes you as literal and
Yeah.
extend it to a new 2 + 2 is 8.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we touched on this, latest and greatest is a challenge, right? Where, you know, like I said, that view 3 example, it's only trained on code that it kind of has knowledge on. Anything kind of new, probably take a bit for it to understand because it needs a big, large code base in order to kind of be able to understand and generate stuff, right? You train these large language models, they need a lot of data. And there's a whole bunch of other challenges, but that's, you know, those are kind of the biggest ones I've kind of encountered. So key takeaways before we go to Q&A. GitHub Copilot is a productivity tool. It's a paid service, right? We always want to be aware of any sort of privacy concerns if we're going to bring it into, you know, day jobs. Very important. The idea of context and prompts, just like ChatGPT, if we kind of understand what's happening in the background a little bit, we can nudge it to get better answers, right? How does it determine context? And it actually does a pretty good job without being aware of this. It'll try to figure a lot of stuff out, but definitely if you have an understanding, it'll give you better results for sure of how it's thinking in the background. It's sentient, right? How it's thinking. And the biggest one is Copilot right now. It's not autopilot. You still have to know what you're doing. You have to be aware of what this thing is surfacing, or yeah, you're going to get some weird stuff in your code. 100%. And that's it. No, 5 minutes over, 4 minutes over.